Hi folks, I thought I might give this little mini lecture on questioning the very construct of dissociation, where I look at some past data sets to investigate whether dissociation is a singular construct and also whether it correlates with trauma in the way that you would expect it to. Now, this is a little research talk that I gave a few weeks ago, but we had some technical problems in the recording, so I want to re-record it for a couple of different reasons. One is I want to carry on developing my own ideas on this topic by talking through the ideas. I want to invite people to make comments on it so that if there's something I'm not thinking about, they can add their ideas. And also I want to make this talk available to students who might be looking at doing a project on the cross correlations between parts of the dissociation idea, parts of the subscales of dissociation, just so that they understand why I have this idea for a research project. Okay, so let's start off with a recent email I got in 2021 where it was quite a critical email based on my previous ideas of skepticism about dissociation, dissociative amnesia, and dissociative identity disorder. And it was from a nurse who works on a emergency department in a hospital, and she communicated in her email that, I have seen dissociation in people's faces after they have lost a loved one, and it went on to criticize me, saying something like, you obviously have not encountered trauma in your own life, and it was quite an ad hominem attack. And it got me thinking about, how emotional the argument is on dissociation and trauma, and how if you apply the scientific method to it, maybe there's some really deeply held truths or deeply held concepts that people advocate for to make an argument perhaps against trauma, which is understandable. But in this talk, let's see what happens to these ideas when you apply a numerical scientific approach to these ideas. And I think if I were to defend myself against the criticism that I'm not concerned about people reacting to a trauma with something that looks like dissociation, I think my criticism is more that the categories are too broad, right? So I would concede that somebody who experiences a loss in the family, something like that, they are told about it in a trauma ward, in an emergency ward in a hospital, I think they are going to feel things like derealization when they hear the news, which is a part of dissociation. But I don't necessarily think that derealization will correlate with other aspects of dissociation. So what I'm advocating for is measuring things more precisely, such as saying that when there's a certain type of trauma where you don't want to believe it's real, you're not sure it is real because you haven't seen it with your own eyes, you've just heard it, then you may feel derealization. But I would hope that that does not get then generalized to, an emergency nurse then saying that because you're feeling derealization now, you may also experience dissociative amnesia, and there's a trauma therapist that you can see who is going to help you, I don't know, recover memories that you've dissociated away. So I'm worried about taking something real, kind of a half-truth that people do really feel derealized, and then applying the whole trauma and dissociation theory to it, along with dissociative amnesia, dissociative identity disorder, and then funneling people who have experienced a loss into suggestive types of therapy, and then there's some damage done by taking the patient who has lost a loved one down the road of trauma therapy that then gives them the idea of dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder. So I think there's hazards to being too vague. So if you're, and this is part of the talk that we're going to talk about being more precise. So if somebody was to say to me, when we give people the news on an emergency room that they seem to feel derealized, they feel that things are not real, then we're in the realm of something I would agree with. But then you have to be careful not to go into the more unlikely, the more pseudoscientific realm of trauma dissociation theory, some of which, might be found in the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation, where I think there is some pseudoscience. Okay, so that is part of the debate that's going on right now. I'm just advocating for precision in measurement, which I think would help in practice too. So let me just go through the history of how the idea of dissociation arose, because I think if I share this with, especially people who don't know this, like students, they will understand where my ideas for checking these relationships numerically come from, right? There's a kind of non-scientific basis from where this theory emerged. It kind of came out of clinical work that involved observing case studies and then just kind of an armchair theorizing rather than measurement. All right, so let's start out by saying that before hypnosis, in the 1780s, 1790s, there was mesmerism. So Anton Mesmer came up with the idea of trance as a curative part of helping people with ailments, especially women with neurotic ailments or with physical ailments that could not be explained. There was three parts of Mesmer's theory. One was animal magnetism, and where magnets were involved. Of course, that's pseudoscience. Another one was using touch to have kind of a feeling effect, which I think was connected to the idea of animal magnetism. And another part that has survived survived 200 years of thought is the idea of trance, the idea that the patients would go into a kind of curative trance in the presence of Mesmer, and then they would be cured. I don't think Mesmer ever cured anybody, but of course people recover from ailments naturally, so that may have been attributed to Mesmer's therapy. All right. So anyway, the idea of trance survived the next 100 years and evolved. Mesmerism evolved into hypnosis. Slowly over time, from 1800 to about 1850, where you had hypnotists such as John Braid in the United Kingdom starting to talk about hypnosis in a different way to what Mesmer talked about. Some new hypnotic techniques playing with the idea of trance and the curative aspect of trance. So it's always been embedded in this idea of treatment of mental illness, sometimes physical illness. And still today, it's embedded into clinical psychology, in some parts of clinical psychology. So hypnosis evolved into the idea that during the hypnotic state, so this is around 1850 when these ideas evolved. So during the hypnotic state that was now induced by the hypnotist, a bit different from before, different techniques, the idea that time is lost during the period of hypnosis, that started to evolve. I don't think it's actually true that time is lost, but That's what people started reporting. At least that's what the hypnotists started reporting that their patients were telling them. I think there's a lot of circular thinking here where the hypnotists would tell the patients that that's what should happen, and then they hear a little bit of that from some patients, and then they write it out themselves. Now that is equivalent to the more recent idea of dissociative amnesia, the idea that there's a period of time that is blocked out because of some kind of trance or walking sleepwalking kind of period of time during hypnosis at this time. Now, the second part was that the sense of self is altered during hypnosis too, similar to what we might later be called depersonalization, which is also a part of this idea of dissociation. And three, that you can become very suggestible and absorbed into what you are doing. That's similar to what we now call absorption. So what used to be attributed to hypnosis slowly evolved into an idea of kind of a walking hypnosis called dissociation, where you're in a state of hypnosis, in a low state of hypnosis constantly, and with all of those three aspects of what used to be thought of as being part of hypnosis. So that's dissociative amnesia, depersonalization, and absorption. So today, those are the three subcategories of dissociation, along with something I'm not going to talk about much today, but identity confusion as well, which might be packaged with one of these. So these ideas were starting to evolve even before the French schools of hypnosis. So the French schools of hypnosis, which I think should be over page, which were the Paris and Nancy schools of hypnosis, starting, I think, in 1860s, 70s, and 80s, that kind of time frame, solidified the ideas about hypnosis that were brought on by James Braid and other people intermediary between Mesmer and these schools. But they started to evolve the ideas away from hypnosis and incorporate trauma into them as well, retaining some of the ideas. So they started to use the word dissociation to indicate a kind of permanent state of hypnosis, right? So in other words, you can be traumatized, and then you can have the three aspects of what happens during hypnosis, such as lost time, feelings of depersonalization that happens during hypnosis, and absorption, suggestibility. And they start to link it to being caused by trauma. So that's different from what James Braid did in 1850s. In the 1850s, James Braid was saying that let's use hypnosis to help cure people. And hypnosis sessions tend to lead to amnesia, depersonalization, and absorption. But that's part of the curative program. But now they were saying that trauma causes a kind of walking day-to-day state of hypnosis, right? Now, this is not based on any numerical study or anything like that. It's just all coming out of the evolution of ideas within what I would call armchair theorizing. So Charcot and Janet in the 1880s explicitly stated that trauma can cause dissociation. This is how the theory started. Now, interestingly, in the Nancy School of Hypnosis, Hippolyte Bernheim emphasized that there's a danger of suggestibility in hypnosis related to absorption, which I think is a valuable contribution that we sometimes miss. Very early contribution about the worry of false memories. Then Freud in the 1890s came up with the idea of dissociative amnesia, approximately as in the form of repressed memories. Morton Prince developed these ideas from the hypnotist to come up with the idea that trauma can cause dissociation to rise so high that it would get you into a category of dissociative identity disorder, which is a defragmentation of identity and multiple personalities. A lot of these ideas, I think, are very flawed. They came out of theorizing without research, but there you have it. And there have been periods since then of a rebirth of Freud's ideas, a rebirth of trauma dissociation ideas of Charcot and Janet. And there's also been periods of skepticism as well. And then skepticism kind of gets dominated by true believers in this theory and so on. So this is where my skepticism comes from, right? It's, you know, it's not at no time in this history did anybody measure trauma, measure dissociation and find a very high correlation. And then they started developing this theory. It was more the case that it was based on arguments from authority. Most of these researchers were well-respected physicians, so they were trained in medicine, and then they were kind of allowed to just observe their patients, suggest things to their patients, and get a circular feedback loop going about their theories. So these are practitioners developing theories without experimentation, really. And this is a little bit out of sequence, but this is James Braid's work that was intermediary between Mesmer and the Paris schools of hypnosis. So I just summarize here. This is out of order, I apologize. But Braid and others left behind the idea of animal magnetism and started focusing on early correlates such as memory loss, loss of self, and absorption. So think of, you know, this talk starting as saying, look, these three aspects of dissociation came from what they used to think goes on in hypnosis, not very scientific. So let's have a look at how robust these theories are. So now the modern dissociation construct is that the idea is that dissociation is a real construct with three components: dissociative amnesia, depersonalization, derealization, and absorption. Those are the main three. There's other ones. There's two that we could talk about another type, such as like identity confusion. And some claim that the Dissociative Experiences Scale is reliable and valid. Now, I'm not sure that is actually true. That's the whole point of the first part of this talk. So let me just even say that even skeptics such as I and my colleague Stephen Lin, who's a brilliant skeptic, but we both fell into not focusing on being skeptical of the idea that the Dissociative Experiences Scale is maybe not reliable, maybe not valid. So, for example, we wrote in 2017 that the Dissociative Experiences Scale possesses high internal consistency, which we're going to evaluate today with some data. So we say that the split half consistency is high, the Cronbach's alpha is high, and so on. Now, we were focused on another criticism in that paper. But did we fail to realize whether that is apparent internal consistency rather than true internal consistency? For example, is that internal consistency of the DES just coming about as an artifact of the way the questions are worded? In other words, if you were to measure those subscales on different scales, would they correlate as highly? And maybe not. Maybe this is kind of a fake kind of internal consistency that if you were to scrutinize and change the questions in a certain way, you'd find that that absorption, amnesia, and absorption do not correlate highly therefore there's not high internal consistency when you measure them in different ways. It'll become clearer later what I mean. So let's first focus solely on dissociation and internal consistency of that measure. And then later on in we'll talk about how trauma correlates with dissociation, which is more to do with a type of validity of what the theory would predict of correlations. So the question is it possible that the three components of dissociation, so memory errors, sometimes called amnesia, depersonalization, and absorption, is it possible that these three subscales are artificially packaged together by the theorizing of early hypnotists that gets repeated from generation to generation? We still have it. And then subsequent scholars have just built on these bad assumptions. And so let's use the Dissociative Experiences Scale to investigate. So let's first look at the Portsmouth database that we collected this last year by Amelia Parker, the MSc student. Now, in this sample, the mean age was 24, mostly female sample. 67% were students, and then about 30-odd% were from social media. So that's why the mean age is just a little bit higher than the average student, because we have some older young adults in there too from social media, and a fairly big sample of 262. And we use the Traumatic Experiences Checklist, sometimes called the Traumatic Experiences Scale or Questionnaire, by Nugent Hoos and colleagues. And we used the Dissociative Experiences Scale by Carlson and Putnam. Now, those are the scales we use throughout all the different data sets we look at today. And the reason we chose that originally is because those two scales were producing the highest correlations in a research synthesis by Dallenberg and colleagues in 2012. So when I saw that, I thought, okay, well, let's just pick out those scales that are most likely to produce the highest correlations, and let's see if the correlations are actually as high. So first, looking at this data set from Portsmouth of young people in the UK. So the three subscales, how did they correlate with each other, right? So does memory errors or amnesia correlate highly enough with absorption and depersonalization to justify putting all of these three things together into one thing called dissociation? And you can see that the correlations are not as high as you would want, but they're fairly high. So you've got an R of 0.7, 0.72, and 0.8. So to answer the question, does this justify packaging these together into a singular construct called dissociation? Well, maybe. These are not as high as you would want. You would want maybe 0.8, 0.9 to put them together into one construct, but they're fairly high. So maybe, but let's have a look at some more data and think about it more deeply. Now let's look at an older data set from California, University of California, Irvine students, and average age 20, 21, that kind of age. And the cross correlations between these dissociation subscales, such as absorption, memory errors, and depersonalization, are actually lower. And you're getting into the range of 0.57, 0.67 here, and 0.57. Now, if you ask the question, are those correlations high enough to think of dissociation as being one unitary scientific measure? I don't think so. I think this is getting very fuzzy. I don't think the correlations are high enough to justify, in the absence of theory, let's put it this way, just statistically speaking, I don't think you would be justified in putting these together into a single construct. So maybe not. Maybe dissociation is not a singular scientific idea, construct. So we have the Portsmouth statistics that say maybe the correlations are high enough. California statistics that say we're kind of getting a bit too low here. But I had the question here, even in the California sample, I wonder if the layout of the dissociative experiences scale and the subjectiveness of it and the same Likert scale under each item artificially inflates the internal consistency. All right, so I'll show you what I mean by that. First of all, let's look at the subjectiveness. Let's focus on that. So if you have subjective questions with a Likert scale that repeats itself, you might get some repetitive answering that leads to artificially inflating the internal consistency of a measure. And this is what I think may be going on, and it can be tested with future research that just does this a little bit differently. So first of all, notice the subjectiveness of the items. So let's look at the directions here. We are interested in how often you have these experiences. So that's part of the instructions. But then later it changes the wording a little bit to say, please determine to what degree the experience described in the question applies to you. And it's a question of degree, which is different from how often. And then it says, circle the number to show what percentage of the time you have the experience. That is slightly different from the other two parts of the instructions. And then you have to ask, is that the percentage of time of the whole 24 hours of somebody's day, or the percentage of the time during which the activity is happening, right? So you're talking about the percentage of the time of a car ride, if you look at question number 1, or you're talking about the percentage of time of the full 24 hours of a day. It is fairly subjective. Look at the question itself. Let's go back. Let's just go back to question 1. Oh, it looks like I can't go back without altering the recording, so let's just carry on. Let's look at the subjectiveness of question number 5. So some people have the experience of finding new things among their belongings that they do not remember buying. Now, depending on whether you bought them 20 years ago or you bought them yesterday, it's so subjective that you could answer 100% of the time if we're talking about finding things in old belongings that you haven't looked at in a long time. But if you're talking about finding things that you bought yesterday, maybe I would answer 0%. So there's quite a subjectiveness to each question. So another question here on the memory errors subscale, or sometimes misleadingly called the amnestic dissociation subscale. Some people sometimes find they are approached by people who they do not know, or who call them by another name, or insisted that they have met them before. So again, that could be subjectively interpreted, right? And you know, is it percentage of the time during the encounters that happens, or the percentage of time of the full 24 hours? It's unclear. But what I think happens in this particular scale is somebody reads the first question and then anchors themselves on a 20 or something like that. And then because the questions are so subjective, they have a tendency to anchor all their questions around 20 once they have chosen that in the first case. And then you can see how this flows into a depersonalization item. Some people sometimes have the experience of feeling as though they are standing next to themselves or watching themselves do something, that they actually see themselves as if they are looking at another person. So that's a depersonalization, derealization item. And because this is also a fairly subjective question, I am concerned that if the person answered 20% here, they're probably going to answer 20% here, or at least anchor themselves around 20%. And then so what you may find is people answering similarly all the way down the scale. When you do an analysis on the internal consistency or the reliability, internal reliability of the scale, you find high Cronbach's alphas and higher correlations between the subscales than you would if you answered the question, if you had less subjective questions and a varying Likert scale, perhaps with reverse coded Likert scales maybe would help. So what I say here is notice how anchoring on one percentage may lead to choosing close to the anchor for the next questions. Now, what if you measure? So if we think about that, what happens if we test that idea? What happens if you measure one of the subscales with another scale? So that's what we did. I found an old data set where we did measure from California, where we did measure absorption with the Telligent absorption scale, which has got a different Likert scale, different wording, and so on. And then we can look at whether the cross correlations between absorption and depersonalization and amnesic experiences is high enough to justify putting all three things together into one scientific construct or concept called dissociation. And look, the correlation here of 0.37 is not high enough to justify thinking of absorption and amnesic experiences as being something that you can sum together into one precise construct. At the very least, what I'm showing here is there's not real internal consistency between absorption and memory errors in dissociation. It's just illusory. It's an illusion brought about by the way the dissociative experiences scale is structured, the way it's subjective, and the way the Likert scale stays the same all the way down. And the Likert scale itself is subjective too. And this is something that could be investigated further in the future, isn't it? By measuring all of these different concepts, maybe introducing identity confusion as well, and seeing if they correlate highly enough to think of dissociation as a scientific, precise thing that you talk about in journal articles, in the DSM, and so on. I don't think it is. It's like a catch-all of experiences. I don't think it's a scientific concept. So anyway, what about if you measure absorption on another scale? So this is session 2. Some of these individuals are different from session 1. Same data set, but we have 2 sessions, and you can see even in the second session the correlation between absorption and amnesic experiences or memory errors, self-reported memory errors, is just 0.5. So this is not the 0.8 or 0.9 that you would want to statistically think of dissociation as a precise measure. It's not. It's made up of different things that don't correlate highly enough. And what about if you measure dissociation with another scale? In this case, this is a state scale of dissociation. So that means your current state. And we're correlating these state dissociation subscales with the DES, which is more of a trait subscales of dissociation, so more permanent reports of dissociation. So state means right now, how much do you feel identity confusion and so on, or depersonalization, whereas the DES on this side is more like in general, how much do you feel depersonalization and so on. But let's just have a look at the correlation between absorption here on the DES and absorption. Where is absorption on the SSD? Oh, they do not have absorption on the SSD as far as I can see. So let's have a look at the correlation between absorption on DES and depersonalization. As you can see, it's just 0.3. Let's have a look at depersonalization on this scale and depersonalization on this scale. or this is what I think I was trying to highlight, even depersonalization on 2 different scales is only correlated 0.42. Let's have a look at amnesic experiences on 1 scale and amnesic experiences on the state scale, and you can see they're just correlated here, 0.07, right? It's a very low correlation, and the point being here that if you measure things using different scales, you may find lower correlations. I think there's a good project here for a student or a researcher to investigate this more fully with trait scales of dissociation. So my conclusion on hypothesis 1, yes, there is some evidence that the cross correlations between dissociation 3 subscales are low enough to really critically question whether dissociation as a concept is a singular construct. I don't think it is. So the subscales themselves may be a bit more singular. In other words, there may be some more precision within the subscale than there is across the concept of dissociation. And I think if you step back and think about dissociation and trauma research, one of the problems I'm kind of thinking about right now is both the measure of trauma is very imprecise and it's a catch-all, and then the measure of dissociation is very catch-all and broad, just like the category of trauma is. And I don't think that's ideal for good research. I think at the very least you want one of the 2 measures that you're investigating to be precise and not a catch-all. You want one of your measures to be a scientific entity that has some precision. You don't really want both measures to be experiences, a broad range of experiences. And if both measures are precise, that's even better. But I think you do get some better data when you've got one of your variables being precise, right? So, for example, in medicine, when you think about the coronavirus, there's something precise about that particular cause, right? It's a specific virus, and then the symptoms are actually broad, messy category of a whole bunch of experiences, but it's a more precise area of research because at least one of the variables is precise rather than both of them being messy and imprecise and broad categories of a whole bunch of experiences. All right, so in future research, to develop these ideas and look at the cross correlations between subscales of the dissociation scale between different measures, you can look at other measures such as the dissociation questionnaire, the multi-dimensional inventory of dissociation, and then there's some interviews you could look at too. Now, I think you have to be careful when you do this because I think some of the same theoretical underpinnings are going to cause problems in these scales too. That's what I predict. But you could use these scales to at least show that cross correlations between subscales may not be as high and may be artificially inflated by the way the instrument is written. All right, so let's move on to the second half of the talk, which is broadening up the topic to look at the relationship between trauma and dissociation. Now, this is answering the question of whether the measure of dissociation is valid in the concept, in the context of theory, right? So the theory goes that trauma causes dissociation. The theory then goes that a tremendous amount of trauma could result in a threshold being met by which over that threshold you might encounter dissociative amnesia. And then there's another threshold that's perhaps higher, more severe, repeated trauma, especially sexual abuse before age 7. In some theories, not all theories, could lead to dissociative identity disorder, which is another category of clinical disorder that is theorized that could be reached with very high levels of dissociation. And the Dissociative Experiences Scale is used in some areas of clinical and psychiatry to give the clinicians some feedback as to whether somebody might be categorized into dissociative amnesia or dissociative identity disorder. And just to illustrate that it's a very widely discussed, widely spread theory. It's even on WebMD. Dissociative identity disorder, it says on that website, is likely caused by severe trauma during early childhood, usually extreme, repetitive, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. In other sub-theories, in some categories, they emphasize that it's more likely caused by sexual abuse in early childhood, from 0 to 7. This theory is also loosely referred to on the National Health Service in the UK's website in a much less problematic way than it is in some journals, and it's mentioned in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Is very widespread. So WebMD, for example, goes on to say, this is one of the first search, if you search for dissociative amnesia, WebMD is one of the first things that comes up, so people see this. As many as 99% of individuals who develop dissociative disorders have recognized personal histories of recurring, overpowering, and often life-threatening disturbances or trauma at a sensitive developmental stage of childhood. And it says usually before age 6, right? So remember that. Some sources emphasize the cause of it being sexual abuse before age 7. I've seen that in quite a few YouTube videos, for example, and Facebook, which are very influential. They're not scientific, of course, but they're very influential in society. Some emphasize that it can be any type of trauma in childhood or early childhood, right? So different theories within different subgroups. So let's test both of those theories, right? So let's first test with hypothesis 2 whether sexual abuse from ages 0 to 6 correlates with dissociation. It should be a fairly high correlation if we expect the theory to make sense, assuming that there's not an enormous amount of measurement error, which there may be. Hypothesis 3 is a more general theory that some people hold, such as WebMD, that trauma from 0 to 6 in general, not just sexual trauma, just all the traumas, composite of all the traumas, should correlate with dissociative symptoms. So this is my thinking. I think it's obvious to you what I'm thinking here. For a causal relationship between trauma and dissociation, one necessary but not sufficient condition is a correlation between trauma and dissociation. If you find a correlation, you're not sure of cause, but you need that correlation. Because the theory is that from 0 to 6 trauma causes dissociation and extreme dissociation causes DID, you must expect a correlation between trauma and DID and dissociation. Now let's just look at the descriptive statistics and the scatter plot of the total composite score on trauma plotted against the total Dissociative Experiences Scale score. First thing to notice here is there is just a small correlation, 0.23, between these composites of all the experiences put together. But also notice that you have to ask the question, within this student and young adult sample, was there enough variation so that we could find a correlation? Is enough variation on trauma? Yes, you can see that spread is enough to investigate correlations from 0 to 40. And you can see the spread of dissociation is also fairly wide enough to find a correlation, if there is a correlation in the whole population, let's say from 0 to 100 on the DES, right? So even though it's young people, there is quite a lot of self-report variance here. Now let's have a look at testing this hypothesis 2, which is, does sexual abuse from 0 to 6 correlate with dissociation, and the subscales of dissociation, and which ones does it correlate with? And surprisingly, in contrast to the theory that we hear everywhere, there is very, very tiny correlations that are not significant, right? So sexual abuse from 0 to 6 is not significant. It does not even correlate with amnesia self-reports in the Dissociative Experiences Scale, or absorption subscale, or depersonalization subscale. So it really does get you to question the idea of, you know, early sexual abuse causing dissociation, and then when it gets to a certain threshold, dissociative amnesia, and then dissociative identity disorder. So I'm sure these results have been found in the past, but they, for some reason, have not been reported. This is an interesting question, you know. So if we would go back to get some data sets that people collected in the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and then did this analysis, I'm worried that we would find similar things, but these findings were not reported, perhaps because of advocacy. I mean, the message that some trauma and dissociation theorists want to advocate for in their writing is to emphasize how trauma is so damaging that it causes dissociation and then dissociative identity disorder. If they find something like this, they may feel that they don't want to report it. But of course, this is not to say that any type of trauma is acceptable if it doesn't lead to dissociation later. It's still unacceptable. You know, all of these trauma types we're talking about are still self-evidently something to advocate against, but not by cooking the numbers on this kind of theory. Now, testing hypothesis number 3, which is the idea that just a general sense of trauma, the composite amount of trauma before age 6, will correlate with dissociation highly enough so that there's a high, it's one of the main causes. But no, other types of abuse from 0 to 6 also do not appreciably correlate with dissociation. The correlations are very low. You can see 0.03. You can see a negative correlation here with sexual harassment. You can see very low correlations here of 0.11. So this is not a one-to-one relationship, as a theory would have you believe. So it's a small correlation with an overall correlation here of 0.11. In other words, composite abuse or composite trauma before age 6 just correlates 0.11, a very low correlation with dissociation, and that's not significant, statistically speaking. Now let's have a look to see if we get some replication from one data set to the next. So we're moving on to the California data set of students in California, UC Irvine, and you can see here that you also find that sexual abuse from 0 to 6 is not correlated with any part of the dissociation scale. Isn't that a consistent finding? So let's have a look at sexual abuse here. 0.011, 0.022, 0.065, extremely low correlations that are not statistically significant, even though the sample size is 314. So there's a little bit of power there, and there is some variance in the measures. And a similar conclusion to the next hypothesis too, that the trauma composite of all the different traumas from 0 to 6 also is only a small correlation of 0.15 with overall dissociation. Here you see trauma composite here, and you can see the DES total dissociation scale is 0.15. All right, so it's not a strong relationship, is it? And then let's test that idea in another data set of the US public. This time, the average age was 38, so it's a different kind of sample. People working on MTurk, 72% female, paid a few dollars to do this scale. And now in this sample, sexual abuse is again not correlated with any part of the dissociation scale. That's 3 data sets that have shown that. And secondly, the 0 to 6 trauma composite of all the different traumas from 0 to 6 was only a small correlation of 0.19 with the total dissociation scale here. So you can see this bottom one, the composite 0.19. So similar conclusion to before with all 3 data sets, 0 to 6 trauma is not a large correlate of dissociation. Isn't that a surprise given what we read in WebMD, what you can read in the DSM, what you can read on various websites, you know, the certainty that you hear on YouTube channels that have millions of followers and so on. So that's 3 failures to find that sexual abuse from 0 to 6 is even a correlate of dissociation. Now, this, of course, could be explained by terrible measurement error, right? So it's possible that the measurement error is so big that if you improve that measurement error, you might start to find a relationship between trauma and dissociation. But I'm not sure. At least there should be some hesitancy to putting forward this theory given these findings. So yes, these are non-clinical samples, but here's an argument. If sexual abuse from 0 to 6 causing dissociation is a general theory, which I think it's put across as being a general theory in humans, it should hold up in any group of humans so long as we have variance enough in both variables. You know, you need variance to do a correlation. So, and there was, you know, so it should hold up even in student samples. It should hold up in any human samples with enough power, enough participants, and enough variance. Now, so how did it get into the literature that such trauma from 0 to 6 is the cause of dissociation? Well, maybe from case studies, maybe from clinical work, not from numerical work if you look at this, which it's severe, you know, how did it get into the literature that then leads to severe clinical syndromes like dissociative amnesia, and then, you know, even higher dissociation leads to DID. So how do ideas get into journals, books, and then WebMD and social media when you don't have the numbers first to demonstrate a relationship? One answer to that question may be advocacy for, you know, trying to show the great harm that trauma does in society, and I can understand that. But my argument there is that you don't really need to show that trauma causes dissociation to advocate against trauma. I think you can advocate against trauma on other ethical grounds, even if the correlation with dissociation is not very high. Now, if traumas from 0 to 6 don't correlate with dissociation, does trauma at older ages in childhood correlate? Well, yes, a little bit, but very low correlations. So trauma from 7 to 12 tends to correlate with dissociation about 0.2. Trauma from 13 to 18 tends to correlate with dissociation and the subscales about 0.2. So again, it's not a great big relationship. It's a small effect size. And then the other question is, if we pick out the age range 13 to 18, just because they had a little bit higher correlations between trauma and dissociation, if we pick out those, what happens if you look at it in more detail, more higher definition, at the relationship between different types of trauma and different subscales of amnesia? Well, what you see is that some types of abuse, let's take emotional abuse, do not correlate with the amnesic scale, do not correlate positively. In fact, they're going in the non-significant, but they're in the negative direction. You find that sexual abuse between 13 and 18 does correlate at about 0.3, 0.26, 0.25 with dissociation subscales, which is a little bit higher than the rest. So you can see that by examining the precise subscales and how they correlate with the precise other subscales of dissociation, you get a better picture as to what types of trauma might be correlating with certain symptoms such as depersonalization, absorption, and self-reported amnesia or self-reported gaps in memory. And looking at the California students with the same question, if we look at age 13 to 18, we find that in contrast to the last data set from Portsmouth, sexual abuse trauma does not correlate with dissociation, right? So look at this, how inconsistent it is, right? So I would want replication from one data set to the next before making a conclusion. So we were just looking at the correlations between sexual abuse 13 to 18 in Portsmouth sample, but in the California sample, you do not find a relationship between that age range and any of the dissociative scales, right? So there's this inconsistency, and when you have that inconsistency from data set to data set, you have to withdraw your theory until you get some replication. And if you look at emotional abuse here, you can see that there's not much of a relationship here, whereas I think there was in the last data set from Portsmouth. All right, so lack of consistency in trying to identify what types of trauma lead to what types of dissociative symptoms, and what types of trauma correlate 13 to 18. Well, you can see, again, sexual abuse 13 to 18 does not correlate with Dissociative Experiences Scale symptoms, the total average, which again is different from the Portsmouth sample. So as you can see, I was hopeful to find patterns from one data set to the next in the specific fine details, but I haven't seen them here. So I just have to not put forward a theory of a relationship. You know, I can't really pinpoint a type of abuse that leads to a specific type of dissociative symptom. So the summary of the findings of all three data sets, the main one is that sexual abuse 0 to 6 did not correlate in those three data sets with dissociation or even any part of dissociation. And then when I try and find patterns from one data set to another, they don't replicate consistently. So you find that sexual abuse does correlate in one data set and then it doesn't in the other two, which kind of raises the question of whether in past research, when they do find what they want to find, do they publish that? And then if they do find some null results in a couple more samples, do they decide not to publish that? I think it would be good to publish everything that is collected in a good way, you know, good quality data.